But there's another kind of sin that God warns us about as well, kind of on the other end of the spectrum. And it's number 2, is the sin of living by our own rules. And what I mean is that we have this tendency where we don't really want to acknowledge that God has set up an objective moral standard in the universe. That God, as creator who made everything, that he has the right and the authority to declare what's right and what's wrong, because it's actually a reflection of his very character. And God can say what's right and wrong, and our job as his creatures is to submit to that and to obey it and live it out. But that just chafes against the human spirit, right? We don't really like other people telling us what's right and wrong, and we'll put up with it if we have to keep our job or whatever it might be. But we just don't. We like to make up our own rules. We like to be our own boss, and so we pretend that we get to decide what's right and what's wrong for ourselves, and then we live according to that standard that we make up. That's what the Babylonians were doing. Again, their example might be a little more extreme than ours, but at the heart of it, they were ignoring God's standards, and they did so to the limit. So let's take a look back at Habakkuk chapter 2. We'll start in verse 15, the 4th stanza. He says, "What sorrow awaits you who make your neighbors drunk. You force your cup on them so that you can gloat over their shameful nakedness, but soon it will be your turn to be disgraced. Come, drink and be exposed. Drink from the cup of the Lord's judgment, and all your glory will be turned to shame." And now down in verse 18, he talks about, "What good is an idol carved by man or a cast image that deceives you? How foolish to trust in your own creation, a God that can't even talk. What sorrow awaits you," there's the 5th one, "what sorrow awaits you to say to wooden idols, 'Wake up and save us.' To speechless stone images you say, 'Rise up and teach us.' Can an idol tell you what to do? They may be overlaid with gold and silver, but they're lifeless inside." So again, what sorrow awaits? Why? What's the issue here? Well, in verse 15, he's talking about those of you who make your neighbors drunk, force your cup on them so that you can, he says, gloat over their shameful nakedness. He's talking about, I'll try to be careful about how I say this. He's talking about forcing their captives into situations where they could take advantage of them sexually. It's definitely not a PG-13 picture here. Now, it's kind of delicately placed in the translation, but the Babylonians were famous for their immoral debauchery, and they were using their power and kind of drugging people in a sense in order to take advantage of them. But then what's interesting is how God immediately then in the rest of the passage seems to connect that sexual excess with idolatry. And he talks next about how these wooden idols that they worship, what's the connection between the two? Well, one of the areas where we like to be our own boss, where we like to set our own standards and rule our own lives, is in the area of sexual expression. Look at our culture today. In the beginning, God created sex to be enjoyed within the boundaries of marriage, where it's a wonderful gift, but humans have always fought against this. We want to be free. We want to be liberated, not to have any of our desires limited in any way. And so when we do that, essentially we're playing God when it comes to morality. Right? We act like we get to decide what's right, what's wrong based on our own desires. But when we do that, again, we're taking upon ourselves the prerogatives that only God owns. And we've just created a little God in our own image, and we've just committed idolatry. So God sees this disregard of moral truth. God sees this idolatry that's created by our own rules and our own desires, and he responds. He says, "What sorrow awaits you people?" He says, "You force drink and shame on others, just wait." In verse 16, he says, "You're about to drink." He says, "Come drink, be exposed, be disgraced." You're about to drink the cup of God's wrath. That's poetic justice. You're about to be exposed and disgraced yourself. That's poetic justice. And then God goes on to mock their worship of these little wooden gods. He says, how sad it is that you cry out to these inanimate statues, cry out, help us, save us, teach us, but they don't hear a thing. He says, it doesn't matter if you cover them up with gold and silver, make them look all, amazing and stuff. He says, they're still inanimate. They're still a fraud. And the same is true whenever we create idols of our own, we create our own little gods, they have no value. We look to them for ultimacy. We look to them to take care of us in some way, but they have no value. Again, you might think, well, that isn't really me, I'm not a Babylonian. I don't drug people to take advantage of them. I don't have little statues in my house that I worship. But we could be closer than we realize, again, because it's this heart issue that can take shape in different ways in different cultures. And so how often do we push back against the idea that God sets a moral standard? Do we say, it's in His Word, we're supposed to live by it in Scripture, but we don't like it when it goes against what we want. And so how often do we say, God, no, I'm just not going to do that, or God, I'm just going to rationalize that away, I'm going to make up some other way to get around that because I don't like the implications of what you said. And how easy it is for us to let the culture's voice be more influential in our lives than God's voice. And how often do we hold our own opinions and our own values as the final authority? Or we worship not wooden idols, not golden idols, but we worship idols of success and status and comfort and security. And when we do that, we push God off His throne. We usurp God's place in our lives. And we put ourselves in His spot, and we just created an idol in our own image. That's a dangerous path, because don't forget how God evaluates this. God's opposed to idol worship back then. He's opposed to idol worship now. We're going to explore this, by the way, later on in the summer, talk more specifically about idols, so stick with us. And it's not just because idolatry is disrespectful and offensive to Him. It is because you think, there's something, God, I love you, but I love this more. That's disrespectful to Him. But because idolatry is empty, it's worthless. That thing that we put so much hope in cannot deliver for us. And so we end up hurt. We end up in pain. So God says, watch out. Don't try to live by your own rules. I've already decided what's right and what's wrong. I'm not going to let it go on forever. Justice is coming.